It's not the years, sweetheart, it's the miles. NES Works enters its second century with episode 101.
Doesn't want to hit.
Hit me.
Don't.
Finally, indie gaming arrives on NES at last, courtesy of a plucky little upstart called Atari. Well, kind of. Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom translates another Atari arcade title from a few years back into NES form. This game in turn translates the 1984 movie by the same name into a playable format. Atari and Lucasfilm had a pretty strong relationship in the early to mid-1980s. Although the very first Lucas-based game, Star Wars The Empire Strikes Back, arrived on Atari 2600 courtesy of Parker Brothers, beyond that Lucas appears to have chosen to gone directly to the source. The original Raiders of the Lost Ark saw an infamously ambitious 2600 adaptation courtesy of Atari and designer Howard Scott Warshaw at the tail end of 1982. And Atari's memorable, vector-based Star Wars coin-op game hit arcades the following year. Soon after that, Atari helped bankroll Lucas's move into game development itself by helping to get that fledgling studio's first two releases, Ballblazer and Rescue and Fractalis, off the ground. Temple of Doom arrived in arcades shortly after the debut of the film by the same name. The second Indiana Jones movie was a whole lot less fun than the first, with darker themes, tons of unfortunate Orientalist imagery, and a sense of oppression, resulting in part from the fact that everything after the first act of the film takes place in a single grim location, rather than gleefully spanning the globe per the rest of the series. The gruesome visuals help cement the need for an MPAA film rating between PG and R. George Lucas and Steven Spielberg have even gone on the record saying that 1989's frothy Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade was meant as something of an apology for Temple of Doom's sour tone. The game itself has a similarly uncertain spirit about it, as it obviously hails from Atari's awkward transitional period between being a failing former industry giant and a pair of smaller companies focused on either hardware or software. You can tell because it appears to use the same game engine as Star Wars Return of the Jedi from the same period, with an emphasis on isometric auto-scrolling race sequences. Temple of Doom offers more than those racing challenges though. The bulk of the game revolves around more iconically indie-like actions, running around whipping stuff mainly. The NES adaptation recognizably resembles the arcade original, but it doesn't attempt to be a direct one-to-one recreation of the coin-op. You'll find the key difference in the way the two games handle minecart sequences. The NES release tosses out the isometric design and standalone nature of the arcade's minecarts. Instead, it integrates the carts as an element of the stages themselves, breaking down the division between platforming and minecart spaces in favor of a unified front in which Indiana Jones can easily move between on-foot action and riding these makeshift vehicles. Accordingly, the NES game greatly increases the complexity of the stage design from what you saw in arcades. The 1984 original presented players with a simple, repetitive, three-phase game loop. You ran around a series of mines, rescuing captive children from cages, then moved to a minecart escape sequence, and finally swiped a Sankara stone relic from the evil thuggy priest Mola Ram. Rinse and repeat ad nauseum. The NES version instead becomes something of a stage-by-stage action title that maintains some recognizable game elements, most notably the general control scheme and platforms and ladder stage design as you attempt to rescue children. Over the course of 12 levels, however, Indy needs not only to save the kids, but also to track down key items, such as fragments of a map. The arcade game's mine stages had a fairly simplistic presentation, consisting of ledges and platforms connected by ladders, and occasionally requiring Indy to use his bullwhip to swing across gaps. This version retains those elements, but the stage layouts take on a far more sprawling form. Once you clear the first level, the mines grow considerably in size and complexity. Before long, each stage incorporates multiple mine areas that Indy can move between at will as he searches for children and treasures. The rail tracks become a critical element of the action as well. Sometimes Indy needs to enter a cave in order to ride a minecart, but eventually the tracks begin to crisscross the main stages, forcing you to leave aboard the cars in order to navigate to otherwise inaccessible spaces. Some levels loop infinitely, often on both axes, and they both contain tiny nooks and hidden spaces that you need to locate through careful observation or by veering off an obvious route into what seems to be a dead end. And just as the levels receive an upgrade in complexity here, so too does Indy himself. Although most of the action continues to center on the adventurous archaeologist running around freeing kids from cages and climbing ladders, he no longer needs to rely entirely on his whip for protection. As in the arcade game, your whip can shatter prison doors, serve as a makeshift grappling hook, and stun foes. Now, however, liberated kids will frequently leave behind alternate weapon icons that Indy can collect to use as he scurries about the mines beneath Pencop Palace. Bombs, pistols, and swords. It's not entirely clear where these lovable scamps acquired such deadly gear, but in any case, it comes in pretty handy for Indy. You have limited uses of each weapon type, and swapping between them involves a slightly clumsy button input combination, but they offer considerably more kick than the standard bullwhip. While the whip can only kill small enemies like spiders and bats, the gun and sword can take out human foes that would only be stunned with the bullwhip. Kids also leave behind a number of other items when rescued, including fedoras for a one-up, gems for time bonuses, keys to unlock doors, statues, and the aforementioned map fragments. Indy can collect and use 2 different types of keys, each of which will lead to different paths through the game, and gathering map pieces determines how effectively you can complete the tricky later stages. In short, developer Tengen kinda did a Capcom here by translating a simple arcade action game into something of a sprawling adventure packed with secrets and hidden objectives. This is not a full-throated endorsement of the action RPG format, but it certainly offers greater replay value than a pure arcade port might have. Players really need to dig into the depths of this one in order to properly complete it. That being said, Temple of Doom does not live up to Capcom's technical standards. Its visuals are pretty ugly, and the music lacks the familiar John Williams punch of the coin-op soundtrack, though on the plus side the NES version dials way back on the incessant chatty voice samples of the arcade original.
Oh!
The graphics here become something of a problem when you factor in the three-dimensionality of the mines. In the arcade version, Indy had a fairly straightforward task when it came to moving around. Run and climb ladders, basically. Here, you can leap down from platforms or jump upward into minecarts, but the forced perspective makes everything very ambiguous. Learning Indy's capabilities and limitations in terms of vertical movement takes a lot of trial and error. And even once you have a basic grasp on the whole thing, it can still pose quite a challenge when you need to make effectively blind jumps to a lower level and hope you hit a platform rather than plunge into a seam of magma. Truth be told, I've never been able to make it past stage 5 or 6, essentially the halfway point of the adventure, because the levels become so sprawling and visually confusing at this point that I effectively end up lost and wandering in a loop, searching in vain for the last missing kid or map piece or exit. It's an ambitious conversion to be sure, even more so than Gauntlet, to which Tengen added a proper quest structure on NES to compensate for its lack of 4-player support. I mention Gauntlet, of course, because as a home conversion of an Atari property for NES, Temple of Doom comes to us courtesy of Gauntlet publisher Tengen as well, though in this case, as with Paperboy, Tengen deferred publishing rights to Mindscape. Well, sort of deferred. As with several other early Tengen releases, Temple of Doom shipped in 2 different versions back in the day, one licensed by Nintendo and one not. I can't seem to find the precise details of Indy's release history anywhere online, and even the history buffs at Gaming Alexandria don't know the particulars. But from what I've been able to determine from contemporary sources, the licensed Mindscape version shipped first, in December 1988. Both Nintendo Power and a June 1988 newspaper column in the Louisville Courier-Journal cite Indy as a Mindscape release. This suggests that the Nintendo evading Tengen cartridge came later, either in late 1989 or sometime in 1990, perhaps because Mindscape let their rights lapse, or maybe because Tengen felt so strongly about this adaptation that they wanted to bring it in-house. As for why this one title would pass from Mindscape back to Tengen, but not a massive hit like Paperboy or existing Tengen franchise like Gauntlet 2, no explanation is forthcoming. It's just one of those weird things. Curiously, this wouldn't even be the last time Indiana Jones would fall victim to competing with himself on NES. 2 releases called Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade would make their way to NES a few years later, one from Taito and one from Ubisoft. Unlike the 2 versions of Temple of Doom, however, these wouldn't be the same code in a new package. They would both be completely distinct games. This is a bizarre legacy for Dr. Jones, and no one seems to know why it happened. We video game archaeologists are still seeking the real treasure.
That was knowledge.
The American arcade hits keep coming with Data East's port of Midway's mindless smash-em-up Rampage. Midway did not publish on NES, preferring instead to license out their games to companies that wanted to deal with the hassles of manufacturing and distribution. We previously saw Midway's Spy Hunter courtesy of Sunsoft, and now here's Data East doing the honors with Rampage. Now, you may recall a few episodes back that Data East deferred one of its own homegrown arcade hits, Bump and Jump, to be published by Vic Tokai. Yet here is the same publisher, bringing a Midway game to NES instead. Poor Bump and Jump. This must be what it feels like to be written out of the will. You can understand why Data East would gravitate more toward an of-the-moment release. Bump and Jump is perfectly fine and decent, but it had also been around for 5 or 6 years by the time it reached NES and felt very much like an early 1980s arcade game. Rampage, on the other hand, was a mere 2 years old, and it felt far more of the moment. The arcade game incorporated 3-player simultaneous action and something approaching sandbox gameplay, as 3 giant monsters smashed the ever-loving hell out of a succession of American cities. Rampage does not have anything like strategic depth, but it does have rollicking good fun and chaotic appeal, and Data East's adaptation, seemingly programmed internally by the company's own staff rather than being farmed out to a contractor like SAS Sakata, managed to beat every other console conversion of the game to market by at least a month or two, giving it the precious US holiday shopping season as an NES exclusive before the Master System and other versions arrived in 1989. It's probably just as well that Rampage got a head start on the competition, to be honest. This port recognizably looks and plays like Rampage, but it lacks a lot of the arcade game's spark. We've already seen the Link's rendition on Game Boy Works Gaiden, and about the only thing this version has over that one is that you can play it on a television where the pixel resolution allows you to see the entire city all at once. Otherwise, Data East makes a lot of compromises to get this hectic multiplayer free-for-all onto Nintendo's aging console. For starters, Rampage on NES does contain simultaneous multiplayer, and it does carry forward that Mario Bros. Style competitive cooperative gameplay. Players effectively race one another to earn the most points by causing civic mayhem, and this involves a great deal of mutual sabotage. You can punch the other player, steal their tasty health-restoring food, or even collapse a building beneath them. Ultimately, though, you share the same mutual goal: flatten 50 American cities to rubble in a bold statement against gentrification. Unfortunately, on NES, only 2 giant monsters can participate in the mayhem together. Again, the option to expand multiplayer participation on NES hadn't yet arrived in December 1988, which meant that developers either had to settle for 2-player action or come up with a kludge. You could ostensibly cram 4 people onto 2 controllers for an anticipation session, since 2 people only needed to share a controller long enough to buzz in. But in an action game in which players need to move around and smash the action buttons at all time, that option couldn't possibly have worked. Thus, 2-player Rampage. In this case, Ralph, the giant werewolf, ends up being treated as the guy of the franchise. Since he appeared in the player 3 slot, he gets left behind here altogether. Instead, players 1 and 2 can only choose to take control of George the gorilla or Lizzie the lizard, with Ralph nowhere to be seen. Of course, the character selections in this version really just amount to a visual choice. George and Lizzie play, so far as I can tell, identically. Both creatures can punch, jump, punch, climb, and punch. That right there amounts to the entire Rampage play loop. You smash up buildings floor by floor, causing them to eventually lose stability and collapse. Once a city has been cleared of high-rises, it's on to the next town. Of course, as we well know, the American establishment values 2 things above all else: the economy and property. And since your attack on property here will undoubtedly damage the economy as well, the establishment has sent out its forces to put a stop to your rampage. As you smash up the towns, an endless procession of military forces attempts to deter your destructive tendencies. The scale involved here, tiny people and vehicles with ballistic weaponry versus enormous slow-moving targets, means that George and Lizzie can't hope to avoid or evade most of the military's attacks. Instead, you need to dodge what you can, soak up the rest, and prioritize health recovery to offset your injuries. Handily, those little armed soldiers make for a tasty snack, as do various civilians who pop up from time to time. Your punch doubles as a grab when a bite-sized human is in range, and snatching up an unwitting person turns them into a quick snack for instant health restoration. You can't simply flail around indiscriminately, however, as many items that appear in buildings and elsewhere will injure you when eaten. For example, if you snack on a lady taking a bath, you'll enjoy a nice energy boost. If you get careless and consume her bathtub as a chaser, however, you'll only hurt yourself. Eventually, the damage inflicted by the military begins to outpace the energy you can restore with a quick bite, and your titanic brute will be overwhelmed, transforming back into a very embarrassed naked human who modestly shuffles off the screen. You can continue infinitely though, so reaching the final day of your cross-country melee doesn't really require skill, merely patience. And herein we have Rampage's greatest shortcoming. It's just not that interesting a game for the long term. As with Cobra Command and Karnov, Rampage really could have used a password feature, but Data East just didn't care. Playing a few stages of Rampage makes for a great time waster, but committing to 50 in a single session with the basic game loop never changes and there's no real strategy for survival or penalty for failure besides your score being reset, that's a lot to ask of anyone, even 80s latchkey kids. Rampage suffers from the strange shortcoming of being simultaneously too much game and too little game. I'm sure Data East made a tidy sum by getting this into stores in time for the holidays, but Rampage would have held up better had the company given it the same loving facelift for home consumption that they did Karnov and Cobra Command. This is mindless multiplayer fun, which counts for something, but the fun definitely doesn't hold up to the end. Next time on NES Works, Sunsoft makes the bizarre decision to gamify an Oliver Stone film.